Have you ever wondered what happens when the impossible becomes inevitable? When two hearts find each other across the most forbidden divide imaginable? When love blooms in a place where it could cost everything, including life itself? Tonight, I'm going to share with you a story so extraordinary, so dangerous, and so deeply human that it will challenge everything you think you know about courage, sacrifice, and the power of connection during humanity's darkest hour. This isn't just another war story. This is something far more profound. Picture this. It's 1944, and the snow falls thick across the Wisconsin countryside. The war rages on distant battlefields, but here, in the American heartland, something unprecedented is unfolding. Behind the barbed wire of a prisoner of war camp, thousands of German soldiers wait out the conflict, far from home, far from everything they've ever known. And in the nearby town, American nurses work tirelessly in military hospitals, treating wounded soldiers who return from overseas with bodies broken and spirits shattered. These two worlds should never have intersected. The rules were clear, the boundaries absolute. Prisoners and civilians were to remain completely separate. Fraternization was forbidden. Contact was prohibited. The consequences for violation were severe, potentially fatal. Yet sometimes the human heart refuses to acknowledge the boundaries that war creates. What you're about to hear is the true account of Maria Hoffman, a dedicated army nurse from Milwaukee, and Johann Weber, a captured German soldier who found himself thousands of miles from his Bavarian homeland. Their story, hidden for decades in personal letters and diary entries, reveals what happens when individual conscience collides with institutional authority, when compassion challenges hatred, when love dares to exist in a world determined to destroy it. But before we dive into their extraordinary tale, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. This isn't just a romance that happened to occur during wartime. This is a testament to the fact that even in our most divided moments, even when entire nations teach their citizens to hate one another, the fundamental human capacity for connection can survive. Their story proves that sometimes the most radical act isn't rebellion or resistance, but simply choosing to see another person's humanity when the world demands that you see only an enemy. I spent months researching this account, piecing together fragments from archives across 3 states. What I discovered was a love story so incredible, so heart-wrenching, and so impossible that it reads like fiction. But every detail is documented. Every stolen moment, every whispered conversation, every heart-stopping close call actually happened in the farmlands and small towns of Wisconsin during the winter of 1944. The prisoner of war camp sat just outside the town of Heartland, a sprawling complex of barracks and administrative buildings surrounded by double rows of barbed wire. It housed over 3,000 German prisoners, men who had been captured during the Allied advance across Europe and shipped to America for the duration of the war. The camp was considered a model facility, clean and well-organized, designed to meet the requirements of the Geneva Convention while keeping dangerous enemy combatants securely contained. Johann Weber arrived at the camp in November 1944, part of a transport of prisoners captured during the Battle of the Bulge. He was 26 years old, a former university student from Munich who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht despite his personal reservations about the war. Unlike many of his fellow prisoners, Johann spoke excellent English, having studied literature before his conscription. This skill would soon make him valuable to the camp administrators, who needed translators and liaisons to help manage the growing prisoner population. Johann was not the stereotypical Nazi soldier that American propaganda had taught citizens to fear. He was thoughtful, educated, and deeply troubled by the violence he had witnessed during his service. In letters to his sister that were intercepted and saved by military censors, he wrote about his longing for peace, his dreams of returning to his studies, and his growing conviction that the war had been a catastrophic mistake for his generation and his country. The camp routine was structured and monotonous. Prisoners woke at dawn, attended roll call, worked on various projects throughout the day, and returned to their barracks in the evening. Some worked in the camp's kitchen or laundry facilities. Others were assigned to maintenance duties, keeping the buildings and grounds in good repair. A select few, like Johann, were chosen for administrative work that brought them into contact with American personnel. Meanwhile, 20 miles away in Milwaukee, Maria Hoffman was beginning her shift at the military hospital that treated wounded American servicemen. She was 24 years old, the daughter of German immigrants who had arrived in Wisconsin in the 1890s. Her family had fully embraced their American identity, but Maria still spoke fluent German, a skill that occasionally proved useful when treating prisoners of war who required medical attention. Maria had volunteered for nursing service immediately after Pearl Harbor, driven by a desire to serve her country and help heal the wounds that war inflicted on young men far from home. She was known among her colleagues for her exceptional dedication, often working double shifts when the hospital was understaffed, and for her gentle manner with patients who struggled with physical and emotional trauma. The hospital where Maria worked occasionally received German prisoners who required medical treatment beyond what the camp infirmary could provide. These transfers were carefully supervised, with armed guards accompanying the prisoners at all times and strict protocols governing any interaction between prisoners and civilian staff. Medical personnel were instructed to provide professional care while maintaining complete emotional distance from enemy patients. The first time Maria encountered a German prisoner, she felt a complex mixture of emotions that surprised her with their intensity. Part of her saw the enemy uniform and felt the anger that years of wartime propaganda had cultivated. But another part of her, the part trained to heal rather than harm, saw a wounded human being who needed her professional skill and personal compassion. Over the months that followed, Maria treated dozens of German prisoners, each encounter adding layers to her understanding of the men behind the uniforms. They were not the monsters of propaganda posters, but young men like her own brothers, frightened and homesick, suffering from wounds and illnesses that made no distinction between friend and enemy. Johann's first visit to the Milwaukee hospital came in December 1944, when he developed pneumonia that threatened to become life-threatening. The camp physician determined that he needed more intensive care than the prisoner infirmary could provide, so he was transferred under guard to the civilian hospital where Maria worked. Their first meeting was brief and entirely professional. Maria checked his vital signs, administered medication, and monitored his progress with the same clinical efficiency she showed all her patients. But something about this particular prisoner caught her attention in a way that others had not. Perhaps it was the intelligence in his eyes, or the way he thanked her in carefully pronounced English, or simply the vulnerability that serious illness creates in even the strongest individuals. Johann spent 3 days in the hospital before his condition improved enough for him to return to the camp. During that time, he and Maria exchanged only the most basic communication required by his medical care. Yet both found themselves thinking about those brief interactions long after he had gone back to his barracks behind the barbed wire. The second time Johann was brought to the hospital, it was for treatment of a hand injury sustained during his work detail at the camp. The wound was not serious, but it required daily cleaning and bandaging that kept him at the hospital for nearly a week. This extended stay provided more opportunities for conversation, though always within the strict boundaries of medical necessity, and always under the watchful eyes of the guards assigned to supervise him. It was during this second visit that Maria first heard Johann speak about his life before the war. He mentioned his studies in literature, his love of poetry, and his family's small farm in the Bavarian countryside. These details humanized him in ways that made Maria increasingly uncomfortable with her own growing interest in his welfare. Johann, for his part, found himself looking forward to Maria's visits to check on his wound. Her gentle care and professional competence reminded him of the civilized world he had known before the war, when human interaction was governed by kindness rather than suspicion and hatred. He began to count the hours between her visits, treasuring the brief moments when she would ask about his pain or explain the healing process in her careful, professional manner. The winter of 1944 was particularly harsh, with heavy snowfall and bitter cold that affected both the camp and the hospital. Johann's third visit to the medical facility came when several prisoners developed severe frostbite during outdoor work details. The camp infirmary was overwhelmed, requiring the transfer of the most serious cases to civilian hospitals. By this time, Maria had become known among the staff as the nurse most skilled at treating German prisoners. Her ability to communicate in their native language, combined with her professional expertise, made her the preferred caregiver for the most difficult cases. The hospital administration had no idea that her effectiveness came not just from linguistic ability, but from genuine concern for the welfare of men she had begun to see as individuals rather than enemies. This third visit would change everything. Johann arrived at the hospital with frostbite so severe that amputation seemed like a real possibility. Maria was assigned as his primary nurse, responsible for the intensive care that might save his fingers and toes. The treatment required hourly attention, careful monitoring, and specialized procedures that only she was qualified to perform. For the first time, they found themselves spending extended periods alone together. The guards, recognizing that Johann was too weak to pose any threat and that his condition required constant medical attention, relaxed their supervision slightly. They remained nearby, but no longer felt the need to observe every interaction between nurse and patient. It was during these quiet hours of treatment that Maria and Johann began to truly talk. Not the brief, professional exchanges of previous visits, but real conversations that revealed the depth of their shared humanity. Johann spoke about his childhood in Bavaria, about helping his father tend their small vineyard, about summer evenings reading poetry beneath ancient oak trees. Maria shared memories of her own childhood in Milwaukee, of learning German songs from her grandmother, of the books that had inspired her to pursue nursing. They discovered an unexpected connection in their love of literature. Johann had been studying German poetry before the war, while Maria had always been drawn to the works of American transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau. Their discussions of these writers created a bridge between their worlds, a common language that transcended the artificial divisions of nationality and uniform. But these conversations were dangerous territory. Both understood that they were crossing lines that should not be crossed, entering into personal territory that military regulations explicitly prohibited. Yet neither could resist the pull of genuine connection in a world that offered so little human warmth. The guards assigned to Johann began to notice the extended conversations. Sergeant Murphy, a career soldier who had lost friends in the European theater, grew increasingly suspicious of what he saw as excessive familiarity between nurse and prisoner. He started making pointed comments about the appropriate boundaries between American personnel and enemy captives. Maria felt the weight of this scrutiny, but she also found herself unable to retreat to purely professional distance. Johann's condition was improving under her care, but slowly enough to justify continued intensive treatment. She used every medical reason she could find to extend his stay, telling herself that she was simply ensuring his complete recovery. Johann understood what Maria was doing, and the knowledge both thrilled and terrified him. That an American nurse would risk her reputation and possibly her career to spend more time with a German prisoner seemed impossible, yet it was clearly happening. He found himself torn between gratitude and guilt, knowing that his presence was creating danger for the woman who had shown him such unexpected kindness. Their conversations grew deeper and more personal as the days passed. Maria told Johann about her struggles with the moral complexities of war, about treating young American soldiers whose bodies and minds had been shattered in battles against his countrymen. Johann shared his own conflicts about the war, his growing conviction that the cause he had been forced to serve was fundamentally wrong. These admissions created an intimacy that went far beyond the usual boundaries between caregiver and patient. They were sharing their deepest fears and doubts with someone who should have been their enemy, finding understanding in the most unlikely place imaginable. The hospital staff began to take notice of Maria's extended time with the German patient. Other nurses commented on her frequent visits to his room, the way she seemed more concerned about his recovery than was strictly professional. Dr. Patterson, the chief physician, made subtle inquiries about whether Maria needed assistance with her patient load. The attention made Maria increasingly nervous, but it also made her realize how much these conversations had come to mean to her. In Johann, she had found someone who understood the weight of moral responsibility in wartime, who shared her belief that individual conscience must sometimes override institutional demands. Johann's recovery was progressing well, and both he and Maria knew that his return to the camp was inevitable. This knowledge added urgency to their interactions, a sense that their time together was precious and limited. They began to speak more openly about their feelings, though always in careful terms that maintained plausible deniability. One evening, when the hospital was quiet and the guards were distracted by a card game down the hall, Maria and Johann had a conversation that would change the trajectory of both their lives. She had come to check his bandages one final time before her shift ended, but instead of the routine medical examination, they found themselves talking about what would happen when he returned to the camp. Johann told Maria that knowing her had restored his faith in human goodness, that her kindness had reminded him of the world he hoped would exist after the war ended. Maria admitted that treating him had forced her to confront her own assumptions about enemies and allies, about the difference between individuals and the causes they were forced to serve. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Sergeant Murphy appeared in the doorway, his expression suspicious as he observed the intimate nature of their discussion. Maria quickly returned to her medical duties, checking Johann's bandages with professional efficiency, but the damage was done. Murphy had seen enough to confirm his suspicions about inappropriate familiarity between the nurse and her German patient. That night, Maria lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what was happening to her. She had always prided herself on her professional objectivity, her ability to treat all patients with equal skill while maintaining appropriate emotional distance. But with Johann, those boundaries had dissolved completely. She found herself thinking about his stories of home, his descriptions of peaceful valleys and quiet libraries, his dreams of returning to a life of scholarship and reflection. More troubling still, she found herself imagining what it might be like to share such a life, to build something beautiful in a world finally freed from the machinery of war. Johann was experiencing his own sleepless night in the hospital room that had become both sanctuary and prison. Tomorrow he would return to the camp, to the barbed wire and guard towers and the monotonous routine of captivity. But more than that, he would be separated from the one person who had made him feel human again during months of dehumanizing confinement. He thought about Maria's gentle hands as she changed his bandages, the way her face lit up when she talked about books she loved, the sound of her voice speaking his native language with careful precision. These memories would have to sustain him through whatever came next, through the long months or years before the war finally ended and he could return home. But even as he tried to prepare himself for separation, Johann found himself wondering if there might be some way to maintain contact with Maria after his return to the camp. The idea was dangerous, probably impossible, but the thought of never seeing her again felt unbearable. The next morning brought news that would complicate their situation in ways neither had anticipated. Dr. Patterson informed Maria that Johann's recovery had progressed enough for his return to the camp, but that he would need to return to the hospital for follow-up treatments over the coming weeks. His frostbite had healed well, but the risk of complications required ongoing medical supervision. This development meant that their separation would not be complete or permanent. Johann would continue to make regular visits to the hospital, providing opportunities for continued contact under the guise of medical necessity. The knowledge brought both relief and increased anxiety, as it meant that their dangerous connection would continue to develop rather than end cleanly with his discharge. Maria realized that she was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of her life. She could request reassignment to different patients, ensuring that she would have no further contact with Johann. Such a decision would be professionally safe and personally wise, protecting her career and her reputation, while ending a situation that was already attracting unwanted attention. But the thought of never seeing Johann again, of returning to a world where enemy prisoners were simply medical cases rather than human beings with stories and dreams and fears, felt like a betrayal of everything she had discovered about herself during their time together. The choice she was about to make would set in motion a series of events that would test every assumption about duty and loyalty, about love and sacrifice, about what we owe to each other as human beings sharing this fragile existence on a planet torn apart by forces beyond our control. Maria made her choice with the quiet determination of someone who had found her moral center in the most unlikely circumstances. She would continue treating Johann, accepting whatever risks that decision entailed. But she also understood that their situation required careful navigation, a delicate balance between following her heart and protecting them both from the consequences of discovery. The first follow-up appointment arrived 3 days later, and with it came new challenges that neither Maria nor Johann had fully anticipated. Sergeant Murphy had filed a report about his observations at the hospital, leading to increased scrutiny from both military police and hospital administration. 2 additional guards accompanied Johann to his appointment, and Dr. Patterson made a point of observing Maria's interactions with her patient. Under this heightened supervision, Maria and Johann were forced to communicate through glances and subtle gestures rather than the open conversations they had grown to treasure. The medical examination proceeded with clinical efficiency, but both felt the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Johann's condition was improving steadily, but Maria found legitimate medical reasons to extend the appointment, ordering additional tests and recommending treatments that would require more frequent visits. Dr. Patterson approved these recommendations without question, trusting Maria's professional judgment while remaining unaware of her personal motivations. After Johann returned to the camp that afternoon, Maria remained at the hospital well past her shift, completing paperwork and organizing supplies while trying to process the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. The increased surveillance had made her acutely aware of how precarious their situation had become, yet it had also clarified how much their connection meant to her. The winter deepened around them, bringing blizzards that isolated the camp and hospital from the outside world for days at a time. During one particularly severe storm, Johann developed complications from his previous frostbite that required emergency treatment. The camp physician, unable to provide adequate care in the primitive infirmary, authorized his immediate transfer to the civilian hospital despite the dangerous weather conditions. Maria was working the night shift when Johann arrived, his condition serious enough to require intensive care. The storm had reduced the hospital staff to a skeleton crew, and the guards assigned to supervise Johann were more concerned with staying warm than maintaining strict surveillance protocols. For the first time in weeks, Maria and Johann found themselves with extended periods of relative privacy. The medical crisis created a legitimate reason for Maria to spend hours at Johann's bedside, monitoring his condition and providing treatments that required constant attention. As his fever broke and his breathing stabilized, they were able to speak more freely than they had since his first discharge from the hospital. Johann told Maria about life in the camp, about the friendships he had formed with fellow prisoners, and the small acts of humanity that made captivity bearable. He spoke about letters from home, about his sister's wedding that he had missed, and his father's struggle to maintain their farm without his help. These details painted a picture of a life interrupted rather than destroyed, a future waiting to be reclaimed when peace finally returned. Maria shared her own fears about the war's impact on her family and community. Her brother was serving somewhere in the Pacific, and her parents lived in constant anxiety about his safety. She described the way the conflict had changed Milwaukee, transforming familiar neighborhoods into centers of wartime production, where friends and neighbors worked around the clock to support the war effort. Their conversations revealed the strange parallel nature of their experiences. Both were living suspended lives, waiting for a future that seemed impossibly distant. Both carried the weight of moral uncertainty about their roles in a conflict that demanded absolute commitment to causes that felt increasingly complex and questionable. As Johann's condition improved over several days, their discussions grew more intimate and more dangerous. They began to speak tentatively about their feelings, using careful language that maintained plausible deniability while acknowledging the connection that had developed between them. Johann admitted that Maria's kindness had given him hope during the darkest period of his captivity, that her voice speaking German had reminded him of everything beautiful about home. Maria confessed that treating Johann had changed her understanding of the war, forcing her to see individual humanity beneath the uniforms and propaganda that defined enemies and allies. The storm that had brought Johann to the hospital also provided cover for these extended conversations. The reduced staff and emergency conditions created a temporary suspension of normal protocols, allowing Maria to spend more time with her patient than would ordinarily be possible or appropriate. But the weather could not last forever, and both understood that Johann's improved condition would soon require his return to the camp. The knowledge that their time together was limited added intensity to every interaction, every shared glance, every carefully chosen word. Dr. Patterson began making inquiries about Johann's extended stay, questioning whether his condition truly warranted the resources being devoted to his care. Maria provided detailed medical justifications for continued treatment, but she could sense growing skepticism from her supervisor about the necessity of such intensive attention for a prisoner patient. The pressure mounted when Sergeant Murphy submitted a second report expressing concerns about the amount of time Maria was spending with the German prisoner. His observations, while not explicitly accusatory, painted a picture of inappropriate familiarity that could no longer be ignored by hospital administration. Maria found herself called into a meeting with Dr. Patterson and the hospital's chief administrator, where she faced questions about her patient care protocols and professional boundaries. The inquiry was conducted with diplomatic language, but the underlying message was clear. Her interactions with Johann Weber were being scrutinized, and any appearance of impropriety would have serious consequences. She responded with professional composure, explaining her treatment decisions in purely medical terms while emphasizing her commitment to providing excellent care to all patients regardless of their nationality. Her responses satisfied the immediate concerns, but she left the meeting with the clear understanding that she was being watched closely. Johann sensed the increased tension during Maria's subsequent visits to his room. Their conversations became more guarded, limited to medical matters, and conducted under the careful observation of guards who had been instructed to report any irregularities. The easy intimacy of their earlier interactions seemed impossible to recapture under such circumstances. Yet even these constrained encounters carried emotional weight that both found difficult to ignore. A touch that lingered slightly longer than medical necessity required, a look that conveyed volumes of unspoken feeling, a word spoken in German that carried personal rather than professional significance. The day finally came when Johann's condition had improved enough to mandate his return to the camp. Dr. Patterson made the decision personally, citing the need to free up hospital resources for more critical cases. Maria received the news with professional acceptance while feeling her heart break at the prospect of separation. Johann's final night at the hospital passed slowly, with both him and Maria acutely aware that their time together was ending without any clear prospect of renewal. The medical justifications that had allowed their previous contacts were exhausted, and future interactions would require new circumstances that might not arise. Maria made her final rounds as the winter dawn broke over Milwaukee, checking Johann's bandages one last time and ensuring that he had everything needed for his return to captivity. Their farewell was conducted in the presence of guards, limiting them to formal expressions of gratitude and professional well wishes. But as Maria adjusted Johann's discharge paperwork, she managed to slip him a small piece of paper containing information that would change everything. Written in careful German script was the address of a church in town where she volunteered, along with visiting hours when she might be found there. The note was a violation of every regulation governing contact between American personnel and enemy prisoners. It was also an act of courage that demonstrated how completely Maria's feelings had overcome her professional caution. She was offering Johann a way to maintain contact, despite the enormous risks such communication would entail. Johann palmed the paper with practiced discretion, understanding immediately the significance of what Maria had given him. The address represented possibility, hope, and danger in equal measure. It was an invitation to continue their connection outside the safe boundaries of medical necessity, in circumstances where discovery would mean disaster for both of them. As the transport vehicle carried Johann back to the prisoner camp, he memorized the address before destroying the paper, understanding that possession of such information would be impossible to explain if discovered during a routine search. The church address became a secret that he carried like a sacred trust, a lifeline to the world beyond barbed wire. Maria returned to her regular duties at the hospital, treating other patients with the same professional competence she had always shown. But colleagues noticed changes in her demeanor, a distraction that seemed to persist despite her efforts to maintain normal routines. She had tasted something extraordinary, and returning to ordinary life felt like a form of exile. The church where Maria volunteered was St. Matthew's Lutheran, a modest building that served Milwaukee's German immigrant community. She had been helping there since childhood, organizing charity drives and assisting with community events. The work had always felt meaningful, but now it took on new significance as the potential meeting place for an impossible relationship. Johann's first opportunity to leave the camp came 2 weeks later, when prisoners were allowed to volunteer for community service projects in nearby towns. The program was designed to provide labor for essential wartime work, while giving prisoners limited exposure to American civilian life under careful supervision. Johann volunteered immediately for an assignment that would take him to Milwaukee, telling the camp administrators that he was eager to practice his English with American civilians. His request was approved without suspicion, as his good behavior and language skills made him an ideal candidate for community interaction. The work detail involved helping with snow removal and maintenance projects at various municipal buildings throughout the city. Johann carefully planned his route to pass by St. Matthew's Lutheran during the lunch break when prisoners were allowed brief periods of unsupervised time to eat meals provided by local organizations. His first glimpse of Maria outside the hospital setting took his breath away. She was organizing donated clothing in the church basement, her hair pulled back in a simple style that made her look younger than her 24 years. The sight of her in civilian clothes rather than her nurse's uniform created an entirely different impression, one of warmth and accessibility that the hospital environment had never allowed. Maria looked up from her work to see Johann standing in the church doorway, and for a moment, neither could speak. The impossibility of his presence in this sacred space, the audacity of what they were attempting, hit them both with stunning force. They were crossing a line from which there might be no return. Their first conversation outside the hospital lasted only minutes, conducted in whispers while other volunteers worked nearby. Johann explained about the work detail program and his ability to request assignments that would bring him to the city. Maria described her volunteer schedule and the times when she could be found at the church without attracting attention. They established a careful protocol for future meetings, using the church's legitimate activities as cover for brief encounters that would appear casual to any observer. Johann would volunteer for work details that brought him to Milwaukee, while Maria would ensure her presence at the church during times when his schedule might allow visits. The arrangement was precarious and dangerous, requiring perfect timing and extraordinary luck to avoid discovery. Both understood that they were embarking on something that could destroy their lives if exposed, yet neither could resist the pull of a connection that had become essential to their emotional survival. Their second meeting took place 3 weeks later, during a community service project that involved helping elderly parishioners with winter preparations. Johann found Maria organizing a food drive in the church kitchen, her hands busy sorting canned goods while her eyes searched constantly for his arrival. This encounter lasted longer than their first, nearly half an hour of conversation that ranged from practical matters about their respective situations to more personal revelations about their hopes and fears. Johann spoke about his growing certainty that the war would end soon, about intelligence reports that filtered through the prisoner community suggesting German collapse was imminent. Maria shared her own observations about changing attitudes in Milwaukee, about families beginning to plan for peacetime while still living with the daily anxiety of ongoing conflict. She described letters from her brother in the Pacific, his accounts of battles that seemed to be moving steadily toward final victory. But beneath these discussions of external events lay deeper currents of personal feeling that both were beginning to acknowledge more directly. Johann told Maria that thinking about their meetings had become his primary source of hope during the long days of captivity. Maria admitted that their brief encounters had become the focal point around which her entire week revolved. The intensity of these feelings frightened them both, yet it also felt like the most real and meaningful experience either had known during years of war. They were falling in love under circumstances that made such feelings both impossible and inevitable, creating a situation that defied every rational consideration while feeling emotionally necessary. Their third meeting arrived during a February blizzard that transformed Milwaukee into a crystalline maze of snow-covered streets and ice-draped buildings. Johann had volunteered for an emergency snow removal detail, knowing that severe weather often created opportunities for extended work assignments in the city. The storm provided perfect cover for a longer encounter, as transportation delays and emergency conditions disrupted normal schedules and supervision protocols. Maria had taken shelter in the church sanctuary when the blizzard intensified beyond what anyone had anticipated. She was supposed to be organizing supplies in the basement, but the howling wind and driving snow created an atmosphere of isolation that made the main church feel like a refuge from the chaos outside. When Johann appeared through the storm, his coat white with accumulated snow, she felt her heart stop at the sight of him materializing from the tempest like something from a dream. They found themselves alone in the sanctuary for the first time since their initial hospital encounters. The church was empty except for them, its stained glass windows casting colored shadows across wooden pews that had witnessed decades of prayers, confessions, and sacred moments. The space felt charged with possibility and danger, a place where they could finally speak freely without fear of immediate discovery. Johann moved slowly down the center aisle, his boots creating soft echoes that seemed to bounce off the vaulted ceiling above them. Maria stood frozen near the altar, watching his approach with a mixture of joy and terror. When he reached her, they stood facing each other in silence, both understanding that this moment represented a turning point from which there could be no retreat. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, the longest period they had ever spent together without interruption. Johann spoke about his childhood in Bavaria with unprecedented detail, describing summers spent reading beneath apple trees, winter evenings when his family would gather around their kitchen table to share stories and sing traditional songs. His voice carried a longing that made Maria's chest ache, with sympathy for everything he had lost. Maria told him about her own childhood memories, about learning to speak German from her grandmother, about the ways her family had struggled to balance their heritage with their American identity. She described the guilt she sometimes felt about caring for someone whose country was at war with her own, the way treating Johann had forced her to confront assumptions she had never questioned. But their discussion moved beyond personal history into territory that felt even more dangerous. Johann admitted that he had begun counting the days between their meetings, that thoughts of Maria had become his constant companion during the monotonous hours of camp routine. Maria confessed that she had started planning her volunteer schedule around the possibility of seeing him, that their brief encounters had become more important to her than anything else in her life. The storm outside intensified as they talked, creating a cocoon of intimacy within the church walls. Wind rattled the windows and snow accumulated against the glass, but inside the sanctuary, Maria and Johann existed in a bubble of warmth and connection that felt separate from the harsh realities of the world beyond. Johann reached into his coat and withdrew a small object that he had been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment to share it with Maria. It was a wooden cross that he had carved during the long winter evenings in his barracks, using tools borrowed from the camp workshop and materials salvaged from various projects. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with intricate details that spoke of hours of careful work. He placed the cross in Maria's hands, his fingers brushing against hers in a contact that sent electricity through both of them. The gift represented months of secret labor, a tangible symbol of feelings that could not be spoken directly but demanded some form of expression. Maria held the cross carefully, understanding immediately the significance of what Johann was offering her. In return, Maria gave Johann a small book of poetry that she had carried since nursing school, its pages worn soft from repeated readings. She had inscribed a message inside the front cover, written in German script that expressed her gratitude for his presence in her life, while avoiding language that could be interpreted as overtly romantic if discovered. The exchange of gifts marked a new level of intimacy in their relationship, an acknowledgement of feelings that had grown beyond casual friendship into something that defied easy categorization. They were not quite lovers, not exactly friends, but something entirely unique created by the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. The storm began to subside as afternoon faded into evening, and both understood that Johann would need to return to his work detail before his absence attracted unwanted attention. Their farewell in the church doorway was conducted with new tenderness, a gentle touching of hands that conveyed volumes of unspoken emotion. Maria watched from the sanctuary window as Johann disappeared into the swirling snow, his figure becoming smaller and more indistinct until the storm swallowed him completely. She remained at the window long after he had vanished, holding the wooden cross and trying to process the magnitude of what was happening between them. The weeks that followed brought a series of challenges that tested their ability to maintain contact while avoiding detection. Camp security had been tightened following reports of unauthorized prisoner activities in nearby communities. New regulations limited the frequency of work details and required more detailed accounting of prisoner whereabouts during off-site assignments. Simultaneously, Maria faced increased scrutiny at the hospital as Dr. Patterson implemented new protocols for treating prisoner patients. Her previous interactions with Johann had been noted in her personnel file, creating a record that could prove problematic if their current activities were discovered. Despite these obstacles, they managed to arrange 2 more meetings during the remainder of February, each encounter brief but emotionally intense. Johann reported growing excitement among the prisoners as news filtered in about German military collapses on multiple fronts. The war was clearly entering its final phase, but the prospect of liberation brought its own anxieties about separation and uncertain futures. Maria shared her own concerns about what peace might bring. Her brother was expected to return from the Pacific, but like many combat veterans, he would likely struggle with psychological wounds that would require years of healing. The hospital was already preparing for the challenge of treating soldiers whose injuries were invisible but profound. Their conversations during these meetings began to focus increasingly on the future, on possibilities that seemed both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. Johann spoke about his plans to return to university studies, about his desire to write about the human cost of war and the capacity for individual conscience to survive institutional pressure. Maria described her hopes of continuing her nursing career while perhaps pursuing additional education in psychology or social work. But beneath these practical discussions lay the unspoken question that haunted both of them. What would happen to their relationship when the war ended? Johann would presumably be repatriated to Germany, while Maria would remain in Wisconsin. The thousands of miles that would separate them seemed like an insurmountable barrier to any kind of future together. March arrived with the first hints of spring, bringing warmer temperatures that melted the snow and revealed the dormant life that had survived beneath winter's harsh surface. The changing season created new opportunities for outdoor work details, but it also increased the visibility of prisoner activities as more civilian observers ventured outside after months of winter isolation. Johann's next assignment brought him to Milwaukee for a project involving the restoration of a public park that had suffered damage from winter storms. The work would require several days of labor, providing unprecedented opportunities for extended contact with Maria if they could navigate the increased supervision that accompanied longer assignments. Maria arranged to volunteer for a community cleanup effort at the same park, telling the church organizers that she wanted to contribute to civic improvement projects as her way of supporting the war effort. The explanation was accepted without question, as volunteer work was considered patriotic duty that deserved encouragement rather than scrutiny. Their first meeting in the park setting felt different from their previous encounters in the church. Working side by side while appearing to focus on separate tasks, they could maintain extended conversations while seeming to casual observers like volunteers and prisoners engaged in routine community service. Johann worked on clearing fallen branches and debris from walking paths, while Maria organized supplies for other volunteers. Their proximity allowed for continuous dialogue that felt more natural and less forced than their previous stolen moments in confined spaces. The conversation that developed over several hours revealed new depths in their understanding of each other. Johann described his growing conviction that the war had taught him essential lessons about the difference between patriotism and nationalism, between love of country and blind obedience to authority. He spoke about his plans to dedicate his post-war life to promoting international understanding and preventing future conflicts. Maria shared her own evolving philosophy about healing, about the way treating wounded soldiers had shown her that true nursing involved addressing emotional and spiritual wounds alongside physical injuries. She described her vision of post-war medical care that would recognize the interconnection between individual trauma and social healing. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Murphy, who had been assigned to conduct random supervision checks on prisoner work details. His unexpected appearance sent waves of anxiety through both Maria and Johann, who were forced to maintain their casual volunteer and prisoner personas while their hearts raced with fear of discovery. Murphy observed their activities with the suspicious attention of someone looking for evidence of inappropriate interaction. He questioned Maria about her volunteer work and Johann about his assignment, seeking inconsistencies or signs of coordination that would confirm his suspicions about their relationship. Both responded with careful composure, providing explanations that were technically accurate while concealing the emotional significance of their interaction. Murphy's investigation lasted nearly 30 minutes, during which Maria and Johann were forced to ignore each other completely while continuing their respective tasks. When Murphy finally departed, apparently satisfied that he had observed nothing more than routine community service, both Maria and Johann felt the profound relief of having survived a close encounter with disaster. But the incident also highlighted how precarious their situation had become and how easily their carefully constructed cover could be exposed. Their remaining time in the park that day was spent in more guarded interaction, both acutely aware that they were being watched by multiple observers who might report unusual behavior to authorities. Yet even these constrained moments carried emotional weight that made the risks feel worthwhile. As the work detail prepared to return to the camp, Johann managed to communicate to Maria that increased security measures were making future meetings more difficult to arrange. The camp administration had implemented new protocols that limited the frequency and duration of community service assignments, reducing opportunities for contact with civilian volunteers. Maria understood that they were facing a potential end to their meetings, just as their emotional connection was reaching its deepest level. The prospect of separation felt unbearable after months of building intimacy, yet continuing their relationship under heightened scrutiny seemed increasingly impossible. That evening, Maria sat in her apartment holding the wooden cross Johann had carved for her, trying to understand what was happening to her heart. She had fallen in love with a man whose very existence in her life violated every social and legal boundary of wartime society. Yet the feelings she experienced when thinking about him felt more real and meaningful than anything else in her carefully ordered world. Johann lay in his barracks that night, staring at the ceiling while his fellow prisoners slept around him. He held Maria's book of poetry carefully concealed beneath his blanket, reading familiar verses by moonlight filtering through the windows. The words seemed to speak directly to his situation, offering comfort and guidance for navigating impossible circumstances. Both understood that they were approaching a crisis point that would require decisive action. The war was ending, circumstances were changing, and their current arrangement could not continue indefinitely. Soon they would need to choose between the safety of separation and the risks of deeper commitment. The choice they were about to make would determine not just their own futures, but their understanding of what love meant when tested by forces larger than individual desire. They had found something extraordinary in the most unlikely circumstances, but keeping it would require courage that neither was certain they possessed. April brought news that changed everything. President Roosevelt's death shocked the nation and created a period of uncertainty about post-war policies, including the treatment of prisoners of war. Rumors circulated about accelerated repatriation schedules and changes in security protocols that could affect every aspect of camp operations. Johann heard these reports with a mixture of hope and dread. The prospect of returning home to his family and resuming his interrupted life held obvious appeal, but it also meant permanent separation from Maria at precisely the moment when their relationship had become central to his emotional survival. Maria received similar news through hospital channels, where administrators were preparing for the massive medical challenges that peace would bring. The end of the war would create opportunities for career advancement and personal growth, but it would also eliminate the circumstances that had allowed her connection with Johann to develop. They both understood that time was running out, that decisions postponed during the relative stability of winter routine could no longer be delayed. The approaching end of the war was forcing them to confront the fundamental question of whether their love could survive in a world no longer defined by conflict and separation. The answer to that question would require them to risk everything they had built for themselves in pursuit of something that might prove to be nothing more than a beautiful illusion created by extraordinary circumstances. But as spring deepened around them and the machinery of peace began to turn, both Maria and Johann were discovering that some things were worth any risk, any sacrifice, any consequence that the world might demand. The decision that would define both their futures came on a rain-soaked evening in mid-April, when Johann received word that his name had appeared on a preliminary repatriation list. The camp commandant had posted notices indicating that prisoner exchanges would begin within weeks, starting with those deemed least likely to pose security risks upon return to Germany. Johann stared at his name on the typewritten list, feeling his world tilt on its axis. Everything he had hoped for since his capture was finally within reach. Freedom, family, the chance to rebuild his life in the country he had never stopped loving despite its terrible choices. Yet the prospect of liberation felt like a death sentence for the most meaningful relationship he had ever known. He managed to get word to Maria through their established network of subtle communications, using a coded message passed through one of the civilian contractors who worked regularly with prisoner details. The note, hidden within a request for medical supplies, contained just 3 words in German that would shatter her heart. "They're sending home." Maria received the message during her evening shift at the hospital, and the simple phrase hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had known this moment would come, had tried to prepare herself for the inevitable separation, but the reality felt devastating in ways she had not anticipated. Everything they had built together, every moment of connection that had sustained them through the darkest winter of the war, was about to be torn away by forces completely beyond their control. The next few days passed in a blur of desperate planning, as both struggled to find some way to extend their time together. Johann volunteered for every possible work detail that might bring him to Milwaukee, knowing that each assignment could be his last opportunity to see Maria. She rearranged her hospital schedule and volunteer commitments, clearing time for meetings that might never come. Their desperation led to increasingly risky behavior that drew attention from multiple sources. Johann's fellow prisoners noticed his agitation and constant requests for city assignments. Maria's colleagues observed her distraction and frequent absences from routine duties. The careful balance they had maintained for months was crumbling under the pressure of impending separation. The crisis reached its peak when Johann learned that his repatriation had been accelerated due to administrative changes in the prisoner exchange program. Instead of weeks, he now had just days before his transport to the East Coast, where he would board a ship bound for Europe. The news arrived with such suddenness that there was no time for careful planning or gradual preparation. Johann made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. He requested permission for one final community service assignment, claiming he wanted to complete a project at the Lutheran Church that had provided him with meaningful volunteer work. The request was approved without suspicion, as Johann's excellent behavior record and approaching departure made him seem like a minimal security risk. Maria received word about the meeting through their usual channels, but this time the message carried an urgency that made her hands shake as she read it. This would be their final encounter, their last chance to say everything that had remained unspoken during months of careful constraint. The weight of that finality was almost unbearable. They met at St. Matthew's Lutheran on a Wednesday evening when the church was empty, except for the janitor who cleaned the sanctuary after midweek services. The setting was the same as their previous encounters, but the atmosphere was charged with emotions that neither could contain any longer. This was goodbye, and both understood that it might be forever. Johann arrived first, standing in the sanctuary where they had shared so many precious moments over the winter months. The familiar space felt different now, heavy with the knowledge that he would never see it again, that the memories created here would have to sustain him through whatever came next. When Maria entered through the side door, her eyes red with tears she had been fighting all day, he felt his heart break at the sight of her pain. They moved toward each other slowly, as if approaching something sacred that might disappear if they moved too quickly. When they finally stood face to face in the center aisle where Johann had first approached her during the February blizzard, the weight of everything they had shared and everything they were about to lose settled over them like a shroud. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before. Without the need to maintain careful boundaries or speak in coded language, they could finally express the feelings that had been building for months. Johann told Maria that loving her had saved his soul during the darkest period of his life, that knowing her had restored his faith in human goodness when everything around him seemed consumed by hatred and violence. Maria spoke about the way treating Johann had changed her understanding of healing, about how their connection had taught her that true compassion required seeing beyond uniforms and nationalities to the human heart beneath. She described the courage he had shown by choosing kindness over safety, by risking everything to maintain their connection when the world demanded that they remain strangers. But beneath these expressions of gratitude and admiration lay deeper currents of romantic love that could no longer be denied or disguised. Johann admitted that he had fallen completely in love with Maria, that every moment apart from her felt like a form of exile from the only place where his heart could rest. Maria confessed that she loved him with an intensity that frightened her, that the thought of living without him felt like contemplating a future without light or warmth or hope. The admission of these feelings created a moment of perfect honesty that was also perfectly heartbreaking. They loved each other completely, but they lived in a world that would never allow such love to flourish openly. The war that had brought them together was also tearing them apart, creating circumstances where their deepest connection had to remain their most carefully guarded secret. Johann reached into his coat and withdrew a letter he had written over many sleepless nights, pouring onto paper everything he wanted Maria to know about their time together and what it had meant to him. The letter contained his family's address in Bavaria, his plans for rebuilding his life after the war, and his desperate hope that somehow, someday, they might find a way to be together in a world finally freed from the machinery of conflict. Maria accepted the letter with trembling hands, understanding that it represented both a lifeline to future possibility and a dangerous piece of evidence that could destroy her if discovered. In return, she gave Johann a small photograph of herself that she had carried since nursing school, inscribed on the back with words of love written in German script that would be meaningless to anyone who might intercept it, but precious beyond measure to the man who held her heart. The exchange of these final gifts marked the emotional climax of their relationship, a moment when all pretense fell away, and they stood before each other as simply Maria and Johann, two people who had found extraordinary love in extraordinary circumstances, and were now being forced to surrender it to forces beyond their control. They held each other then for the first and last time, their embrace carrying the weight of everything they had discovered together and everything they were about to lose. Johann breathed in the scent of Maria's hair, trying to memorize every detail of how she felt in his arms. Maria pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and wondering how she would survive the silence that would follow his departure. The embrace lasted until they heard footsteps approaching outside the church, reminding them that even this final moment together was borrowed time that could be interrupted at any instant. They separated reluctantly, both understanding that prolonging their goodbye would only make the inevitable separation more painful. Johann walked toward the church entrance, then turned back for one final look at the woman who had changed his life completely. Maria stood in the center aisle where their love had first been acknowledged, her hand pressed to her heart as if trying to hold something inside that threatened to escape. Their last words to each other were simple promises that felt both essential and impossible. Johann swore that he would find a way to contact Maria after the war, that he would spend whatever time was necessary waiting for the world to change enough to allow their reunion. Maria promised that she would keep his memory alive in her heart, that no matter what the future brought, she would always treasure what they had shared in the sanctuary of St. Matthew's Lutheran during the winter of 1944. Johann left the church and walked through the Milwaukee streets for the final time, his transport back to the camp scheduled to arrive within the hour. Every familiar building and street corner felt like a goodbye to a life he had never really lived, but had dreamed about during their stolen moments together. Maria remained in the sanctuary long after Johann had gone, sitting in the front pew and holding the letter he had given her, while tears flowed freely down her cheeks. The church felt empty in ways that went far beyond the absence of congregation, as if something essential had been removed that could never be replaced. The next morning brought news that Johann's transport had departed during the night, carrying him toward the first stage of his journey back to Germany. Maria learned of his departure through hospital channels, where prisoner transfers were noted in administrative logs that treated human lives like inventory items being relocated between warehouses. She continued her nursing duties with professional competence, but colleagues noticed changes in her demeanor that persisted despite her efforts to maintain normal routines. The joy that had illuminated her face during the winter months had been replaced by a quiet sadness that seemed to permeate everything she did. Johann's journey took him first to a processing center in New York, where repatriated prisoners underwent medical examinations and administrative procedures before boarding ships bound for Europe. The facility was crowded with men eager to return home, their excitement palpable as they discussed plans for reunion with families and resumption of interrupted lives. But Johann felt disconnected from their enthusiasm, as if he were observing their joy from a great distance. His body was traveling toward freedom, but his heart remained in Wisconsin with a woman whose love had become more real to him than anything else in his experience. The prospect of returning to Bavaria without her felt like a form of exile rather than homecoming. The ship that carried Johann across the Atlantic was filled with former prisoners sharing stories of their captivity and dreams of their futures. Many spoke about sweethearts waiting at home, about marriages postponed by war that could finally take place in peacetime. Johann listened to these conversations with a mixture of envy and sorrow, knowing that his own love story had no such happy ending in sight. Meanwhile, Maria was discovering that Johann's departure had left a void in her life that seemed to affect everything she did. The hospital routines that had once felt meaningful now seemed mechanical and empty. Her volunteer work at the church became a source of pain rather than satisfaction, as every corner of the sanctuary reminded her of moments they had shared. She carried Johann's letter with her constantly, reading and rereading his words until she had memorized every phrase. The photograph he had treasured was hidden in her apartment, but she found herself looking at it every morning and evening, using his image as an anchor to memories that felt increasingly dreamlike as days passed without contact. Spring gave way to early summer, bringing news that the war in Europe had officially ended with Germany's surrender. The announcement created celebrations throughout Milwaukee as families rejoiced over the prospect of loved ones returning home. But for Maria, the end of hostilities felt like the final severing of any connection to Johann, the closing of a chapter that had given her life meaning beyond anything she had previously experienced. Johann reached his family's farm in Bavaria to find a landscape transformed by years of conflict and defeat. The countryside he remembered from childhood had been scarred by bombing and occupation, its people struggling to rebuild lives from the fragments left by total war. His parents had aged dramatically during his absence, their faces marked by years of anxiety and hardship. The reunion with his family was joyful but complicated by the changes that captivity and love had wrought in Johann's character. He was no longer the young student who had been drafted into military service, but a man transformed by experiences that had challenged every assumption about duty, loyalty, and the nature of human connection. Maria and Johann's story reminds us that love doesn't always conquer all, but sometimes survival is victory enough. Their forbidden romance proves that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual acts of courage and compassion can transcend the hatred that divides nations. They discovered that the human heart recognizes no boundaries when it encounters another human heart in need. In a world that seems increasingly divided, their correspondence offers hope that understanding between peoples is always possible, always worth pursuing, and always worth the risks involved. Sometimes the most important victories happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when one person chooses to see the humanity in another.